for today's video, I will be sharing how I turned bits and pieces of plate into this post-apocalyptic rover diorama. Let's get on with the video. Hi, I'm Nico and welcome to my channel. So, aside from liking mecha and sci-fi stuff, I've always loved watching and reading about post-apocalyptic stories as well. And so I always had the plan to someday build a post-apocalyptic diorama for the channel. And today is that day. About 2 years ago, I made some Junkbots using pill bottles and such. But I haven't had the time to build another one ever since I started this channel. So for today's video, I will be making my first 1:35 scale diorama. So this robot or Junkbot is made from scraps of plates with some cables and other junk parts for detailing. I started this build right in the middle of the beetle diorama, which is why you will see some shots of it in the background of this video, because I was procrastinating on weathering that car. So I started an entirely new project. Thankfully, I managed to finish both in time. I did not really have any plans for this build. I just knew I wanted to build something out of scraps and junk parts. So I got to work on doing just that. And then later on, while it was slowly starting to take shape, only then did an idea struck me. I decided to keep it simple and took inspiration from my first junk bots and made this one into a rover or an explorer of some kind. A robot that could be for collecting information or samples, or simply a guide for the remaining humans on the planet. I did not add a ton of detail on this kit, and only added some simple designs like squares and such, along with some minimal scribing with SAB panel liners, of course. I was not bothered whether the look of the robot is perfect as well, or if it had some cracks or gaps that I wasn't able to cover up, because I didn't need for it to look perfect since it's gonna be a robot in a post-apocalyptic world. So having some errors here and there actually helps it to look better. So after I was pretty satisfied with how the rover turned out, I also decided to make a human companion for it. So I got this 1:35 scale military figure. This is the only one remaining on the runners, and I also don't have the manual for it. So I'm not sure where it came from, but it's probably from Tamiya. So anyways, I don't want to have to follow the rules with the color scheme for the uniform and stuff for this figure. That's why I decided to modify it a bit and give it a post-apocalyptic feel, rather than just being a soldier. I've never worked on a figure before, even just painting one is something I've never done. So maybe I'm overestimating myself by wanting to modify this figure. But I thought that it would be as simple as just taking some bits and gluing it onto the figure. And so that's what I basically did. I just glued an oxygen-looking tank part on the figure's back to show that the air is toxic, and then I got some Procreate to add an oxygen mask to his face. This made him look more from a post-apocalyptic world, but also made him easier to paint with half his face covered. So the arms were in a bit of a weird position, so I basically just replaced one of it with a plastic rod and gave him a robot arm, which works since this is supposed to be set in a post-apocalyptic world. And then after that, I also added some more parts and some cables to bring everything together. Moving on, I got started on making the base for these figures. I'm enjoying the plaster of Paris more than I thought I would. That's why I'm using it again. I decided to make some rocks with the plaster using foil as the mold. I actually wanted to do another diorama with some more bricks like my previous build, but I saw this round wooden base that I figured would be perfect for the figures, but too limited in space to make another detailed brick wall. So I just decided to make a simpler base. So unlike the bricks that I did previously where I only had to wait 15 minutes for it to dry, I decided to leave the plaster to dry overnight just to be safe. And while waiting for that, I decided to make a simple add-on detail to the diorama with some wooden sticks and made a signpost before I'm done for the day. The next morning, I removed the foil from the plaster and got my rocks ready to be painted. I was pretty satisfied with the shape, look, and texture of the rocks that I did not do anything aside from breaking some of it in smaller pieces to fit onto the round base. I was surprised that it was not that easy to actually break it in smaller parts. I figured I could just smash it onto the ground, but I actually needed to use a handsaw to be able to cut it. So after planning the layout of the rocks, I went ahead and glued it onto the base with some wood glue. You can also use a hot glue gun for an instant bond. But for me, personally, when I do diorama work, I usually just stick to using white glue or wood glue. Just because that's what I'm used to. But feel free to use a glue gun if you want. Anyways, I figured the glue would be dry enough and ready. So, I got some Vallejo texture paint dark earth and applied it over the base. I made sure to cover everything with it, especially the nooks and crannies, as I don't want any of the plaster to show through. The texture paint is essentially like a primer. It makes everything look more put together and helps you to visualize your diorama better. Also, because it cures like rubber, it also protects the plaster in a way. I also have to let the texture paint dry before I can do some more work to it. So I decided to prime the figure in black before I did some zenithal shading off camera. If you want to learn how to do zenithal shading or painting, I'm pretty sure my dad has some videos about it, which I will link down below. I also borrowed my dad's wet palette and got started on painting the figures. I started painting the human or the survivor first. Just because I feel like it's easier to paint him than the robot. So for this build, I decided to mostly do brush painting. So aside from the primer and zenithal shading, everything will be brush painted from here on out. The reason is simply because sometimes I get bored of using the airbrush. It just becomes a bit too repetitive for me at times, and I figured since I would need to brush paint the survivor, might as well do brush painting for the robot as well. And in a way, it's gonna be practice for me because I'm not very good at brush painting just yet. As I mentioned earlier, I never really had the chance to paint or work with figures before, at least figures this big, since Gunpla is a lot smaller in scale, and there's not much figures there. Painting military figures like these are not as extreme and sophisticated as painting miniatures. So I basically just added some thinner medium to make the paints more transparent, which will enable the zenithal shading to show through. I also added some paint chipping onto the rover just so it's not too clean before I moved on to the diorama base again. After varnishing the figures, I set it aside and then did some pigment work onto the base. I always try to use at least 3 different shades of pigments to give variety and make the base look more realistic, since soil usually has more shades in real life. After adding the pigments and varnishing with the matte varnish, I glued the figures onto their place before adding some more weathering. For the rover, I added some mud texture onto the tracks, just like in military tanks, which is where I got the inspiration from. And then I also added some splashes of mud on the rover and a few splashes on the human as well, before I decided to also make the ground muddy. And then I used Vallejo texture paint European mud for the ground where the human is stepping on, which I later added onto the ground where the rover is stepping on, before adding some dried and dead tufts to show that the grass and plants cannot survive in this post-apocalyptic world. I also added a few more details onto the diorama, just like adding some dried tea leaves onto the ground to make it look more dirty, just like what I did with the Zaku diorama before I called it good.